you very much, Ken Corla, and as others have done, no doubt, I just want to acknowledge the presence of the Ukrainian ambassador and the distinguished guest gatherer for what is a very sad occasion as we mark the second anniversary of Russia's full-scale invasion of the sovereign territory of Ukraine. I think 2 years ago, just on the eve of the war, when we think back and we all watched Russia's troops amassing on the border with a sense of foreboding and I think a sense of disbelief that we were going to again see a war on continental Europe, a land war on continental Europe. I doubt many of us would have predicted that we would still be in that state of conflict some 2 years later. I acknowledge the solidarity of peoples all across Europe for those defending their homeland from Russia's illegal aggression, and that should be acknowledged, but it's absolutely nothing alongside the courage and commitment of those Ukrainians directly engaged in the conflict and the defence of their homeland. If Volodymyr Zelensky, whose greatest battle up to then had been Dancing with the Stars, if he'd turned tail and run to some apartment in New York to, live out his days as some president in exile, I doubt any of us here would have been greatly surprised. In fact, I think it's probably what Vladimir Putin was counting on. Instead, he's shown us to be one of the great wartime leaders. Rather than accept a US offer to evacuate, he told the world, "The fight is here, I need ammunition, not a ride." I think that's a line that's going to resonate down through history. It's a great counterfactual, but how different would the Ukrainian resistance have fared against the Russian onslaught if their leader had taken the easier decision to cut and run? Would they have been able to hold out so valiantly against such overwhelming odds? I suspect not. And would Ukraine have been as successful in eliciting the support needed to counteract that superior force without President Zelensky's work on the international stage, eyeballing world leaders with that sense of moral conviction of somebody who's chosen to stay and fight rather than cut and run? Again, I very much doubt it. When we look at Putin's model for this war, we can see what we're seeing here is a full spectrum war. It's been fought obviously at the front lines, that typical hot war. It's been fought with conventional weapons, albeit with newer technologies applied. It's been fought in the digital world. It's been fought through information networks, in attacks on cyber securities. Across Europe, it was fought as an energy war. Primarily, it was about throttling the supplies of fossil fuel energy in an attempt to undermine European solidarity. In this, I think the war, in a sense, was the last sting of a dying wasp. I suspect Putin's advisors had said, the era of fossil fuels is drawing to a close, and if you want to leverage the fossil fuels that we supply into Europe, now is the opportunity to do so. Russia had that stranglehold over energy in Europe, and that was going to be loosened sooner or later. I think there's an irony in the fact that the conflict has indeed precipitated an energy transition that I don't think we could have imagined across Europe on the eve of the war in its pace and in its scale. All across the developing world, it's been a war waged through resources, and it's been a war waged through hunger. And I think of the immense collateral damage that we've seen all across the developing world, and I think of the Horn of Africa in particular, where commodity prices, food prices went through the roof. And it really is a war that has weaponized human suffering and the immiseration of people who are already locked out of so many of the opportunities that we'd experience here in the Western world. And I think long before the actual physical transgression of Ukraine's borders, Putin's forces had been laying the groundwork for what they expected to be a speedy victory. A concerted campaign of disinformation, the use of troll farms across social media channels, were aimed at weakening Western democracies. We should be alive to that continuing threat now. A very real one, and Russia is by no means the only bad faith state actor who is out there seeking to undermine our democratic processes. I think we should be especially alive to that in 2024, a year of elections, with almost half of the world's population going to the polls this year. And we should be increasingly aware of the power of the digital tools that are at the disposal of people who want to interfere in our democracies in that way. I think we're also seeing writ large the failure of Ostpolitik, as practiced for many years by the CDU in Germany, with the flawed rationale that economic dependencies would insulate us against military aggression. It was a myopic policy that was built on the promise of cheap energy, upon which so many of our economies, but particularly the German economy, was founded. Deliberately, strategically cheap energy, which was aimed at undermining energy security and creating dependency. And I think we should learn the lessons of that failure, that our democratic countries should not be built on the energy resources of despots. That's one of the many harsh lessons that I think we should take from this conflict. And I would say in that regard, Ireland is almost uniquely well placed to help implement those learnings. If Ostpolitik taught us to look east for our energies to undemocratic countries, then the future energy that we hope to generate, particularly off the west coast of this island, we should be encouraging the democracies of Europe to look west for that energy, to look to one of the most stable and long-lived democracies within Europe, which is ourselves. What other lessons do we need to look at? What other lessons do we need to learn from this conflict? This might be very long lens, but we do have to ask ourselves about what geopolitics is going to look like in a post-growth Europe. Currently, our geopolitics is very much aligned with that vying or jostling for position based on a very simplistic GDP measurement of growth. We know that that is not sustainable in the longer term. We know that we need to decouple emissions from what our understanding of what it is that economies do for us as a society. But if Europe becomes one of the first movers in that process, how does that change the interaction in terms of geopolitics? As I say, that might be long lens view, but it is a question that we need to grapple with. I do agree with the views of Richard Wouters, who says that a well-being economy could be a geopolitical asset, and that the normative power, which is that power to project and to export one's value, that is an essential part of what it is to do geopolitics, and I think it's the part that Europe has been most successful at. We haven't established ourselves as a military power. I wouldn't like to see us become a military power, but that power that we have in terms of normative power is important. I think what Putin failed to grasp when he initiated this war was the resilience of the Ukrainian people, but also the solidarities of people across Europe who I think realise that what's happening in Ukraine is a defence of our European democracies. You are at the front line of defending so much that's good in our European continent. And I think as a nation here in Ireland, we have responded. There are certainly huge issues. There are issues around pressures on resources, pressures on services. We see that wider immigration issue coming to the fore within political discussion. But I think the long lens of history will tell us that Ireland has responded well to this, that we have risen to the challenge, that when we were called upon to provide services and refuge for so many Ukrainian people who came to our shores seeking that safety, that we rose to that challenge. And Ken Corley, I very much hope that we continue to rise to that challenge for the length that this prolonged period of conflict lasts. Thank you very much.